and welcome back to another episode of the TEPI Podcast, a series where you can hear from the diverse voices of people working and learning towards peace in Northeast Asia. In the last episode, we got to hear from Paul Lee, who shared a bit about his work at the United States Institute of Peace, his experience podcasting, and a bit about his perspective on peace. In this episode, you'll be hearing from Mary Popeo. Mary is the co-founder of Peace Culture Village, or PCV, which is a Hiroshima-based youth-led nonprofit dedicated to promoting a sustainable global peace culture through social entrepreneurship, peace education, and youth empowerment. Mary also recently took on a position in government relations consulting at GR Japan, which is the largest government relations and public policy firm in East Asia. Through our conversation, we talk about how Mary ended up in Japan, her story of helping build PCV, and her recent transition to government relations consulting. We also touch on Mary's experience as an American in Hiroshima, the nexus of digital technology and peace building, and prospects of peace building as a career. I hope you enjoy what this conversation has to offer. So without further delay, here is Mary. Mary, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's really great to get to talk with you. For those who don't know you, could you briefly just give a little introduction about yourself and the work that you're involved with?
Of course. First of all, Austin, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this podcast. I'm an avid listener, so I'm very excited to be on. And for everybody listening, my name is Mary Popeo, and I'm originally from Boston in the United States. I come to today's conversation from a background in nonprofit management, youth empowerment, peace education, and community building. And I am co-founder of PCV, or Peace Culture Village, which is a Hiroshima-based peace education nonprofit and social business. And I'm also an associate at GR Japan, which is part of the largest government relations and public policy consulting firms here in East Asia. And I'm very excited to be here today.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there we can dig into, and I'm sure we'll have time to talk about a lot of it. But before that, I want to kind of go back to kind of how you first got started on a lot of the work that you're involved with. I read that you started with some trips to Hiroshima and Nagasaki while you were studying in college, kind of doing a little bit of research about nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. I was wondering if you could share a bit about how you got interested in those opportunities to begin with, and kind of how those early trips were formational for you.
Sure. So I guess it's a little bit embarrassing, but to be perfectly honest, the reason I originally was interested in visiting Japan and going abroad, I was an RA at Boston College school. And so I actually couldn't study abroad. And so instead, I decided to apply for some study grants that Boston College offered so that I could finally get an opportunity to go abroad. And then the question kind of became, okay, what do I research? I guess the original impetus for the research was actually going abroad. But as a student at Boston College, which is a Jesuit university, I was very interested as a Catholic in Catholic history. And there's a really interesting and tragic history of Christian persecution in Japan. And I'd learned about that in class. So originally, kind of that desire to go abroad and my interest in Christian history are what prompted me to apply and then receive the research grant. And so when I was a sophomore in university, I ended up going to Nagasaki in Japan for about a month to study that Catholic history. And I had never learned deeply about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki up until that point. So what I learned there shocked me quite a bit. So going to the museum in Nagasaki and seeing there are these rosaries there that have been scorched and irradiated by the atomic bomb. And I think that was really personal for me to see all of these items that I have in my own home and that I use as a practicing Catholic very often that had been just destroyed by the bombing, and thinking about the families and about how the atomic bomb had been blessed by a Catholic priest.
Wow, yeah.
it was extremely conflicting. And I think that might have been the first time for me in my life where I seriously considered my role and responsibility as a global citizen and felt very much angst filled.
Yeah.
So that was my first visit to Japan. And I think since that summer, I really haven't been able to get this theme of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the bombings. They've been very much present in my life.
Yeah. So it sounds kind of like you, in some sense, stumbled into this almost by coincidence or by accident. And then it was such a, like you said, shocking and such an eye-opening experience that you kind of got pulled into it. Yeah, that's really impressive. So I'm wondering, kind of from there, you have these experiences as a college student, and I heard that you'd gone back several times each summer as you were able. And then I'm assuming it was after you graduated, then you were able to go to Hiroshima and help co-found PCV. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Like you said, I had been back to Japan almost every summer from that point on other research grants from my university and then other grant opportunities. And when I graduated from university, I had been volunteering and continued to volunteer for about 2 years as a peace activist with many different groups like the AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, and also Global Zero. And at the same time, I was juggling full-time jobs around Boston. But I really wished after graduating that I could turn my peace activism into a full-time job.
Yeah.
And around that time, I reached out to my mentor, Stephen Leeper. He's former chairman of the Peace Culture Foundation, which manages the Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima. And I'd gotten to know him over my years of going back and forth between Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the US. And I explained to him what I was thinking. And it coincidentally happened that he was planning to found a nonprofit in Hiroshima. And he invited me over to help him with that. And so I was, 24 and I didn't have a visa and I didn't have a salary, but I moved to Hiroshima about 6 years ago to see if we could get something going.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the beginning of all of it.
Wow, that's such a big leap. But yeah, if that's the passion or the direction that you're kind of hoping to go, you gotta just jump in, I guess.
Yeah. And I don't know if I thought at that point that I would be here for so long, but yeah, I think I was very, very excited about the opportunity.
A couple of the other guests on this podcast are also living in different countries than they were born in or grew up in, and they also, it seems like a similar theme. A lot of people who enter into this type of work kind of think, oh, maybe it'll be a year or two or a couple of years, and then it tends to expand. And it's a common theme I've encountered. So you mentioned kind of going during those summer trips was kind of really eye-opening and shocking for you. And I'm sure that kind of through your helping co-found PCV, there was a lot of experiences there as well. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the experience of being an American specifically who was living in Hiroshima, and kind of your encounters with the bomb survivors and with trying to work in that context, specifically as an American in a city where the United States dropped an atomic bomb.
Oh, that's a good question. There's so much that I could talk about. I think me and so many people who are involved, especially in the disarmament space, are where we are thanks to the atomic bomb survivors. And I remember when I first visited Hiroshima, I think that was the first time that I met and really developed relationships with atomic bomb survivors and their descendants. And I think I was expecting some sort of hostility as an American being there, not only from survivors, but just from people in general. I did not experience any of that. People were so welcoming. And I think what was really transformative for me was experiencing the beautiful city that once had been a barren wasteland. And then talking to these atomic bomb survivors, they're called hibakusha in Japanese, talking to the hibakusha who were openly welcoming me, an American, from the nation who had done this to them. I think I saw with my own eyes that it was possible for humans to overcome seemingly insurmountable tragedy. And it was possible to do it with love and forgiveness. So after the bomb, the survivors picked up the pieces of their city and very consciously chose to break the cycle of violence and to rebuild their city in an image of peace and forgiveness and reconciliation. And to me, I think hearing that from survivors, I was really confused.
Yeah.
And I just thought, how is it that they are able to react this way? And then since getting to know them better, I now understand that it's actually quite complicated. It was not easy for them to do. And many of them, even though they might give tours to Americans in Peace Park and to soldiers and do this really amazing reconciliatory work, they still have that pain and that trauma, and they choose to set it aside in order to work toward peace. Because one of them, a survivor I'm very close to, Ito-san, he always tells me that if you don't cultivate peace within yourself, it won't be possible for you to create peace externally for the people that you care about. And so I think this knowledge that people in the world say peace is not possible. Humans can't create peace. But the survivors, I think they've done it. I think they're proof that peace is possible. And that knowledge that peace is possible, I believe, is one of the most important things for our world. And that getting to know these people who have done a really, really difficult thing, it inspires me a lot and has really inspired me to dedicate my life to this work. So I could go on and on. Every survivor is unique. Everyone has kind of a message they want to stress and to promote, but they've completely changed my life. And one more thing I'll say on this topic is I received a mission from Ito-san, actually, the survivor I mentioned before, to spread the stories of his story and the stories of the survivors to English-speaking people and nations. And during COVID, that became a lot more difficult because there were not as many or almost no people from outside of Japan coming into the country. And so for the past 2 or 3 years, I've been doing a lot of speaking to Japanese groups, actually. And for a long time, I felt extremely uncomfortable and worried about this because I am an American, right? I'm from the aggressor nation. I thought that I'm maybe taking the voice away from the voices of the survivors or descendants or people living in Hiroshima. And I work with many third and fourth atomic bomb survivor or descendants and with the survivors. And they all told me that if only Japanese people and only people from Hiroshima are doing this work, nothing will change. And that it can't only be Americans. It needs to be people from around the world. And so they've really encouraged me to work through that within myself. And I think that's a conflict that I still deal with.
Yeah.
But I also now see the value of having a team of atomic bomb survivors and their descendants working together with Americans. It's almost a miracle in order to spread their message and their legacy. So it is kind of a complicated identity.
Yeah. I think the message that your mentor gave you of if you don't cultivate peace in yourself, you can't give peace to others or create peace in the world. I think that's such a powerful message. And especially like you were kind of saying how they had to actively choose to rebuild their city as a city of peace. And like I've heard other people talk before of how like in some sense violence is like a narrowing of choice. And like it sounds like this action that they're doing to actively choose itself is part of the peace of kind of rejecting the violence of not having choices and saying we will choose peace and to make our city peace and to spread this message in ourselves, among ourselves and around the world, and kind of inviting other people like yourself or like others to make that choice as well. That's Yeah, that's a beautiful message.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I know you were there for 6 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm curious, like during that 6 years, and you mentioned how you've kind of gone on to another position now, but how do you think you would compare like what you thought of peace or what you thought peace is before getting to work in Hiroshima and then kind of after having the 6 years of experience? How did that kind of transform your vision of peace?
Yeah, that's a great question. So PCV stands for Peace Culture Village. My mentor, Steve, used to work at the Peace Culture Foundation. This term, peace culture, was actually born in Hiroshima and was coined by an atomic bomb survivor named Ichiro Moritaki. He talked about peace culture and war culture.
Mm-hmm.
And a peace culture, when we talk about peace, I think especially at PCV, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about kind of what exactly we do in a minute, but we work a lot with youth, and peace is kind of a difficult topic to talk about and conceptualize. It's so big. So when we say, how do we create world peace? I think it's very amorphous and difficult to tackle for a lot of youth. But
Sure.
when we talk about peace culture, all of us live in and shape culture, whether we're aware of it or not. And I like to think to myself that every day I might act in a way that perpetuates and creates peace culture in the world or war culture in the world. Peace culture, according to Moritaki-san, being a society that's very collaborative, that strives for the well-being of all people, that is nonviolent, and war culture being a very competitive society, not so much friendly competition like we sometimes see in sports, but more competition at the expense of the well-being of a certain group of people, and then tends to be violent. So I believe we all, and Moritaki-san believe that perhaps we all have both of these inside of us. And so all of our choices are important. When we talk about world peace, maybe a lot of young people think, what can I do? This is such a big thing, maybe for politicians or world leaders to care about. But I think the concept of peace culture really empowers us to focus on the change we can create and the impact we have in our own lives. So since moving to Hiroshima and learning about this concept of peace culture, I think that my views of what peace is has changed a lot. My view of the impact I can make has changed a lot. I also think this is not so much the definition of peace, but more how to create peace. When I was an activist in Hiroshima, I was trying really hard to convince people that nuclear weapons should be eliminated. But what I found is that I was much more often convinced than convincing. So people would posit various ideas, and then I would say, oh, those are interesting ideas, and get very sidetracked. So I think another thing I've learned is the role of an activist is extremely important. And there's also another role that's very important for peace building, which I think is not trying to convince someone, but instead listening and learning and dialoguing, and what I would call peace education, helping people to think for themselves about what peace is to them, what their values are, what kind of leader they want to be, how they want to impact the world. So I've also, I think, had a mindset in terms of how I want to build peace and how I'm maybe more naturally gifted in building peace. There have been quite a lot of learnings, I think, since moving to Hiroshima.
Yeah, it sounds like you've kind of, I guess, in some sense, learned how to learn about peace.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds very cool. So you mentioned, or maybe we could go back and touch briefly on what exactly PCV does, like what type of projects or what kind of stuff they're doing.
So PCV has had a lot of identities. When we first founded it, we tried quite a lot of things. We tried being an eco-village, focusing on activism, on English teaching. And what we found is that nonprofit and social sector in Japan is quite weak compared to the US, for example. And it's not easy to survive solely based off donations. So about 2 years ago, we made the switch to a social business model and we brought in new staff, and we finally kind of found where we're going to live. And so today, PCV is a youth-led nonprofit dedicated to promoting peace culture through social entrepreneurship, peace education, and youth empowerment. I think what makes us stand out in Hiroshima, but also around the world, is that we're a team of Americans and third and fourth generation atomic bomb survivors that are our staff. Unlike a lot of organizations, we are completely run by youth, people in our 30s and under. And again, the atomic bomb survivors inspired us to dedicate our careers to peace work. But as you might know, they aren't going to be with us for much longer. The average age of the survivors is now 84 years old. And in 3 years, a newspaper in Hiroshima reported recently, 37% of atomic bomb survivor groups will have to cease their operations. And the reason is because of a lack of successors and a lack of funds. And so PCV, with our mission, we aim to tackle those two issues, the issue of succession and the issue of funds. So we use immersive technology and youth-to-youth mentorship programs steeped in the lessons of Hiroshima and the Hibakusha to empower youth to enter the peace and disarmament space. And importantly, we also enhance their prospects for sustainable involvement by offering them paid work in the peace field, which is quite new in Hiroshima because peace work has been done volunteer since the bomb was dropped and Hiroshima was rebuilt. But last year, our team of 60 paid youth leaders ran programs for over 10,000 people from 45 different countries. Our online programs became JTB, the top travel agency in Japan's #1 online program. Our work has been featured on the government of Japan's social media channels. It's been really amazing to see actually how much of a need and a demand there is for our programs. And so over the past 2 years, we've been really inspired to work with youth to empower them to really envision and act on the future they want to create. And one other area that we are kind of making a name for ourselves in is in the technology space. We have created VR tours of Hiroshima Peace Park, walking tours. We've created an AR app called Xplore Hiroshima. That's an X and then Plore. If you want to look it up, you can download it for free on the Google and Apple app stores. That will allow you to interact with atomic bomb survivor holograms and have a tour of Peace Park in augmented reality. But yeah, I say that our work revolves around young people learning and teaching other young people about what happened in Hiroshima and about themselves, how they want to now, having learned what they've learned, make a difference in the world in a way that's sustainable and fun for them.
And have you found, it sounds like there's been a lot of growth for PCV in the past few years. Have you found that there's kind of a deep thirst among young people, or does it take a little bit more convincing or a little bit more kind of trying to recruit or pull in people to get them interested?
Yeah. So our team, as I said before, we have a team of about 60 Hiroshima youth who are running all of our programs. And we actually find there is quite a desire because in Hiroshima, there's actually a mandatory peace education curriculum that all of these students have learned. It's something I think is quite amazing about Hiroshima is that they're a peace culture city, not only in name, but also systemically, right? So they learn about what happened in Hiroshima in their formal education. They listen to the survivors and they learn about peace. And so many students in Hiroshima want to act on what they've learned. And it's become sort of a big frustration for them, I think, that it's a lot of input and not so much output. So at Peace Culture Village at PCV, we provide a space for them to become mentors to students who are just a little bit younger than them, who are currently undergoing these sort of peace education curriculum, or who are even from other places in Japan or around the globe. So they become kind of representatives of Hiroshima, the next generation. They're able to talk to these young people about why they decided to get involved in peace work, what their difficulties were when trying to think about how they wanted to create peace in the world and where they're currently at, and then encouraging their counterparts to learn about themselves and what they want to do and what their dreams and goals are. So yeah, I think there's a really big desire from these Hiroshima youth. And then we also find that there is a desire from educators and from businesses. And especially, we do programs for a lot of people in the Japanese education system. There's, I think, also a big need for education surrounding global citizenship, the SDGs, peace, and social issues. And so all of that we tackle in our programming, which we customize for each client, each school or business, to from the lessons of Hiroshima. Talk about that.
You mentioned the word business a few times, and I think sometimes peace activists or people in peace education, I've seen like a little bit of resistance to like business kind of language or words, but it seems like for PCV, it's really naturally integrated and working really well together. I wonder, has there been any tension between this kind of business mindset and this peace education mindset?
Yeah, that's such an excellent question, because I think especially in Hiroshima, there is a big resistance to this. As I said before, the survivors and activists who have been doing this for a long time, I think there's a culture of doing peace work volunteer. And some of my colleagues who, again, are third and fourth generation atomic bomb survivors, were very nervous about taking PCV in this direction. And we get comments like, well, maybe you're just doing this for the money, or you're not even real peace activists. You're young people, right? How could you have the gall to do this professionally? But there are also a lot of people in Hiroshima who just support what we're doing. I think the reason is because there are many young people who graduate from university like I did and maybe a lot of people listening to this podcast have had this experience or are having this experience. You want to dedicate all of your time and energy to something that's going to make a positive impact in the world, but there's no jobs in it. And so the reason that we think combining the epic social mission of the social sector with the financial sustainability that comes with business, a lot of I would call us a social business and a nonprofit, is not so we can get rich, but it's so that we can survive and eat and make a living while we're doing this important work. And if industries that perpetuate war culture are I don't know, drawing the biggest and best talent because they can actually afford a living wage, and how are we going to create a strong movement and attract the best and brightest minds to peace work? So I think, 2 years ago, PCV made a very intentional decision and we actually brought in people from the business sector with no nonprofit experience, because we believe this is really important. And we believe there may be a lack of business acumen in the nonprofit sector, and believe that would be very helpful to helping us make our movements more sustainable.
Oh yeah, it seems like you guys are having a lot of success with that kind of merging, and that's really inspirational to hear. And I think that I'm sure a lot of young people listening to this podcast also maybe kind of feel inspired by that, but maybe don't quite have a sense of like, well, I want to join, but I don't like, how do I jump into that as well?
Right.
Or maybe like the area they're living doesn't have as much kind of robust peace education or opportunities like that. I wonder if you have any advice for young people who are kind of interested in the nonprofit sector or peace building world, but aren't quite sure like how to get their feet into it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would not be here today if it weren't for mentorship. Ito-san, the atomic bomb survivor who I'm close with, or Steve, who founded this nonprofit with me. I think mentors in the social sector have been so critical to me being where I am. And a lot of them would be so excited if a young person reached out to them and said, I'm interested in learning about the social sector and helping where I can, or whatever social issue you're passionate about. Reaching out and doing volunteer work to start, I think is a really excellent idea, just the connections that you make. In terms of people interested in making peace activities their career, I would encourage you to look into social businesses and B Corps. Actually, in America, I knew people who graduated out of college and went to work for nonprofits. So, but here in Japan, that is quite rare. It's not often about a viable career path. But social businesses are, especially in Japan, they're now rising. So in other words, they have a viable business model. And at the same time, the reason they're in business is in order to create a positive social impact. I think of Patagonia as a really excellent example. But Japanese GDP, I think now 3.5% is now generated by social business. So that could be a really interesting opportunity to look into social businesses. But I also think, this is maybe another additional comment, that most young people won't go into the social sector or become activists. And so even if you go into a position, for example, right now I'm in consulting, or some of our young youth leaders, they might go into business or government. Those knowledge sets are critical for our peace movements. I really believe that. And that's something that actually inspired me to take a step out of the social sector. I believe we need people with a diverse range of skills and passions, and people who are committed to making the world a better place, to be in all sectors. So just because you aren't doing something that aligns with social impact at the moment or full time does not mean that you cannot make an impact, is another thing I want to say.
Yeah. And I think that's where the word you use, peace culture, kind of comes into play, where it's not necessarily like a list of things we have to do, but more of a culture that we're trying to establish around the world and make a norm. And like wherever we're at, we can make that choice to build that culture or not. That's really important.
So we often talk kind of about the peace Avengers. So like if we all go into our various sectors, but we keep in touch through our core values and the vision of the future that we have, someday when we are more powerful, we are adults, more powerful than we are now, having those connections in that network, we might really be able to make a significant change together. So I would say that no matter what sector you go in, there are always possibilities.
I love that image of peace Avengers. That's great.
I do too.
Yeah, that's so great. So now you've made a career transition, and you're in this government consulting and kind of public policy position, and still supporting PCV's work on the side, of course. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you made that transition and what you're doing now, and how you see your role now connected with peace culture, or this kind of making the world better, I guess we could say broadly.
Yes, good question. So at PCV, we have a motto or a catchphrase, and it goes, know yourself, change the world. And so I think in my work at PCV, I've become a professional and quite good at helping young people to identify their values and how they want to live and to lead, and how they can contribute in a way that they feel called to. However, when it comes to changing the world, I was beginning to feel unbalanced in my knowledge, having ever only known grassroots change, bottom-up change, and the social sector. And with everything happening in the world, especially when it comes to climate change, nuclear weapons, and everything happening in Ukraine, I'm getting impatient, I guess. Education is extremely important. And what PCV is doing in the education field is necessary and powerful. And I still believe that 100%. But I also want to understand top-down change. And I want to understand how government and business work. And I want to understand where I can actually make the most swift and strong impact, right? Me, Mary. And I wanted to complicate my worldviews and understand the nitty-gritty of policy, and hopefully get an understanding of how the nonprofit sector and social sector, especially in Japan, might work together more effectively with business and government to increase the impact of their work. So those were all things that drove me to take one foot out of my work at PCV. So now I, as you said, am working full-time in consulting and government relations consulting. It's a completely new field for me, but it's definitely checking all the boxes. I'm learning so many things and I'm really enjoying it so far.
So you said that you're doing this job as a full-time job and then also still helping with PCV a little bit on the side. Mm-hmm. And that's a theme I've noticed with several of the guests on this podcast, is that they're engaged with work that's really more than a full-time investment of time and energy. Mm-hmm. And so a question I really like to ask is, how do you stay rooted and sustainable in the work that you're doing?
That's such a good question. I cannot honestly tell you I have figured this out. No, I think, that's a really good one. And to all of y'all out there listening who are struggling with this, I commiserate. So I think, balance is really crucial for especially people who are doing what they love or what they believe is important. It can be so hard to set boundaries. And in my experience, there have, of course, been experiences of burnout, but I also think one phenomenon that I experienced while working at PCV is that everything in my life became PCV. All of my relationships, anyone I met, I was trying to pull them into the work. No activities outside of work. And that's mostly because I was having so much fun, and it was, is an important life mission, but that also has downsides, right? I'm a person who tends to feel a lot of pressure, and that my value is based on the amount of work that I do. I tend to feel guilty when I take time to rest, and all of these it can not be good for your mental health at times. And so I am actually working with a therapist and executive coach who has helped me a lot to work on balance. And something I don't know, ironically, I guess, learning from my job in consulting, where they do not encourage us to work overtime, and they've instructed us not to look at emails outside of work. I know, it's quite lovely. It is that rest is as important as work. I'm still learning to this idea, but I think especially now that as an organization, as PCV, that we have new people, we actually have new college graduates that are coming to work with us full time. We've realized that we need to change our own working habits and our culture as an organization. So it's definitely a huge challenge that, I'm working on, and have found the concept of balance to be really critical.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to balance, especially when, like you said, when we're doing work that we love, it can be hard to kind of separate and to find that space for rest. But I hope you're able to definitely find some time for that self-care, and that's fun. Is there anything about your work that I didn't ask that you'd like to share about?
Yes. So, well, I kind of already touched on this, but I just one more time want to emphasize our app, Xplore Hiroshima with an X. This app, once again, I would love if everyone listening would give it a try, and maybe give us a rating, or it's free on the Google Play and Apple Store. And this app, it actually recently, we won first prize in the social messaging division of the Undiscovered Gems Grand Prix. Wow. Yeah, this year. And so for me, I have always been really into video games. I've loved VR and immersive technology. And this was the first time that I really saw that technology can be harnessed to help people empathize and stand in the shoes of people who are different from them. And so I, am really interested and intrigued in conversations about the metaverse and immersive tech. And there's so many hurdles to be overcome, from energy and inequity and things like that. But I think that these types of technologies have so much potential when it comes to social impact. And so I don't know. That's just a conversation I'm really excited about right now.
Yeah, that sounds so cool. Yeah, I'll definitely put a link to that down in the description so anybody listening can definitely check it out.
Yes, that would be lovely.
Well, Mary, it's really been a pleasure getting to hear about the work that you're up to and hear a little bit about your story. Thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you, Austin. It's been a pleasure.
So that was Mary Popeo. Hopefully you were able to learn something new or perhaps gain a fresh perspective on something old. If you want to find links to some of the stuff we talked about in this episode, be sure to look at the show notes. If you've been following along with the other guests who have come on this podcast, you likely already know that peace building is a broad field with diverse perspectives and approaches. Each guest brings a bit of that perspective with them into these conversations, which I hope makes this podcast a valuable resource for your own peace building practice and study. If you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, follow on SoundCloud, or subscribe to PEACEMOMO's YouTube channel. If you're interested in the other work TEPI does, you can check us out at momotepi.org. That's momotepi.org. That's all I have for you today. I'll talk to you in the next episode with another guest sharing their perspective on peace in Northeast Asia.